All right. So my name is Tom Kalil. My primary professional background is in the area of science and technology policy. I worked for both President Clinton and President Obama. And one of the questions that I was interested in is, in the same way that we decided to put astronauts on the moon and to sequence the human genome and to drive down the cost of that from $100 million for the first one to $1,000 today, what are the similarly ambitious goals that we should be setting in the 21st century? And I'll give you a couple of examples of the ones that I worked on and that my colleagues worked on. So one example was the BRAIN Initiative, which President Obama announced in April of 2013. And the goal was, could we develop tools that would allow us to understand the brain in action? So currently, we can measure the activity of a very small number of neurons with high levels of temporal and spatial resolution. Or we can take a fuzzy picture of your entire brain using a technology like fMRI. But in the middle, at this mesoscale, at the level of large-scale neural circuits, we currently don't have the tools that allow us to understand the brain in action. And the hypothesis of the BRAIN Initiative was that with an investment in tools, in the same way that we made this investment in high-throughput sequencing, we could increase our understanding of how the brain encodes and processes information. So in the same way that in molecular biology that we have this central dogma of the way that information flows from DNA to RNA to proteins, that we would have something like the neural code. Ultimately, that would improve our ability to diagnose, treat, prevent, and cure diseases of the brain. And it could also inform new computational architectures that are informed by how the brain works. So that's an example of one that I worked on, building a coalition that included the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, IARPA, which is the DARPA for the intelligence community, and the National Science Foundation. It had such a high level of bipartisan support that Congress did something that they almost never do, which is to provide 10 years of funding for the NIH component of the BRAIN Initiative. So it has survived the transition from the Obama administration to the current administration. I had colleagues in the Department of Energy that were working on one called Moonshot, where the goal was to make solar cheaper than coal. Working with DARPA during the Ebola outbreak, which happened in 2014, we were able to get additional funding for an idea for dramatically improving our ability to respond to pandemics. So, if we have an emerging infectious disease and we currently don't have a therapy or a vaccine, the usual response of the research community is, give us 10 years and we'll have something for you. Obviously, that's not terribly satisfying if lots of people are dying. So the idea that DARPA was pursuing is, what if we could reduce the time required to develop a medical countermeasure from years to months? And you may have seen some stories in the press and the scientific literature that says that we now have antibody cocktails that are reducing Ebola mortality by 94%. And that's an example of something that grew out of that program. So the idea is you identify a patient who has been exposed to a pathogen, you isolate the most effective antibodies, then you create a synthetic oligonucleotide construct that directly encodes for those antibodies. And that's something that could be done in months rather than years. USAID was worked on a number of these grand challenges related to global development, including one called Saving Lives at Birth, which is all about reducing newborn mortality and maternal mortality in the first 48 hours after birth. And another thing I worked on was just more generally increasing the ability of the government to use incentive prizes like the X Prize Foundation. So when I worked for President Clinton, I was able to get DARPA prize authority, which they used for the self-driving car competition. The second time they ran that team at Stanford, led by Sebastian Thrun, won the competition. Larry Page was at the finish line, and he promptly acquired the winning team. So that's where the Google effort came from. So those are things that I was able to do working for President Clinton and President Obama. But the broader question that I'm interested in is, what would it take to create a moonshot culture? And by that, I mean that there are more individuals and organizations not only in the government, but in the private sector, investors, research universities that are involved in the identification and pursuit of an ambitious goal in the same way that Bill Gates wants to eradicate polio. Elon Musk has said, I want to die on Mars, but not on impact. So his modest goal is making humanity a multiplanetary species. A coalition of 100 engineering deans that we brought together has created something called the Grand Challenge Scholars Program that allows students to organize their coursework, research, service, learning, entrepreneurial activities, and international activities around one of the grand challenges identified by the National Academy of Engineering. And one of the things that I think could have an impact is more investment in agenda setting and a particular type of agenda setting. So the first element of this agenda setting is what's the goal? So can you identify goals that are intrinsically motivating? So for example, if I told you that we should have a cure for Alzheimer's, I would not need to explain to you at great length why that would be a good thing, right? So the goal itself should be intrinsically motivating, and you should be able to imagine a bright 20-something saying that I'm going to devote a good chunk of my professional career to trying to achieve that goal. The second is there a why now? Has something changed about the world that leads us to believe that that goal is now within reach? So for example, because of this, our improvements in our ability to identify antibodies and create a gene-encoded antibody, I believe that it is no longer fanciful to talk about the goal of dramatically reducing the time to go from bug to drug, from an emerging infectious disease to an appropriate response. But if someone said, wouldn't it be cool if we could teleport? I would certainly agree with that, but we have unless you're talking about a photon, we have no earthly idea about how to do that. So the second thing is, has something changed about the world? Technological advances, some new business or financial model, some expansion of our fundamental knowledge about ourselves and the world around us, some demographic change that leads us to believe that this goal is now within reach. And the third thing, and I think this is particularly relevant if one of the audiences, as I believe it should be, for this agenda setting are philanthropists, is there both an entry point and an exit ramp for philanthropists? Most philanthropists are not so interested in supporting something indefinitely. So if you can tell them, hey, there's this investment that you can make that will be catalytic, and you will not have to support it indefinitely, then philanthropists are more likely to support that. Currently, we have 2,000 families that have $500 million or more in wealth. Their current level of philanthropy is 1.2%. So if you assume that they're doing as well as an index fund, they could be dramatically increasing their philanthropy by a factor of 5 without any net reduction in their wealth. So that is definitely, I think, a ripe target. And when we think about what it is that they might be capable of doing, in addition to philanthropy, they could also engage in investing, in providing patient capital to startups that are pursuing high-risk, high-return ideas. They could engage in advocacy, and they can engage in coalition building. Because most of the problems that we're talking about are not going to be solved by an individual or even an individual organization. So I want to close by telling you about the thought experiment that I used to pose when people were unwary enough to visit me when I was working for President Obama. Because a lot of times people would come to me and they would say, Tom, you're never going to believe it, but the issue that I work on is really important. And I would say, what is it that you want me to do? And they would have no answer to that question. So I used to pose the following thought experiment to them, which is you have 15 minutes with President Obama in the Oval Office. And he says, Allison, if you give me a good idea for advancing existential hope, I will call anyone on the planet. It can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line, but you have to tell me not only what is your idea, but in order to make your idea happen, who would I call and what would I ask them to do? There were 4 reasons for that thought experiment. One is that if you worked for the president, you had a very strong sense of what psychologists call agency. That is, you had the ability to send a decision memo to the president and have him check the box that said yes. And rightly or wrongly, that gave you an increased sense that there were more things in the status quo that were potentially changeable, as opposed to being fixed like the laws of physics. So how do you communicate that sense of agency that you have to other people? The second is it's a version of the Hammond question. If you really did have a meeting with the president, presumably you would talk to him about something that you thought was really important, as opposed to a second or third tier question. The third is that, as I said, most important problems require building a coalition. It's difficult to build a coalition if you can't articulate who are the members of the coalition and what are the mutually reinforcing steps that you want them to take. And then finally, asking that question to enough people, like kissing frogs, occasionally enables me to identify someone who has identified a trim tab. A trim tab, as Bucky Fuller put it, is the tiny device that moves the rudder, that moves the ocean liner. So I'll just give you one example of an interesting trim tab. In the late 1970s, the Department of Labor changed the fiduciary standards for what owners of pension funds were supposed to do, and explicitly said that they were allowed to invest a small fraction of their assets in a high-risk, high-return asset class. And making that change led to a dramatic increase in the amount of institutional investors that were investing in venture capital. So it seems like it's a relatively small change, but if you think about all of the first and second order consequences of the Department of Labor changing that regulation and much more money going into venture capital between today and 1979, that's an example of a trim tab. And if you want to participate in this question of identifying and pursuing these moonshots, come to the session tomorrow. Thank you. Go team.
Thank you, Tom. You can stay right there. Thanks so much. I strongly encourage you to also check out an 80K interview that he did. It's on a podcast by 80,000 Hours. For every one of you who are scientists wanting to work in government or wanting to move that trim tab in government, he did a fantastic, I think, 2-hour interview on how to be efficient in the government. And it obviously makes me pretty hopeful about what's happening behind the scenes. I think I saw a whiteboard that you once had of how you were deliberating and prototyping in the White House while you were there. So it's really refreshing to hear that things have been moving there, at least for the while that you were there. Okay, with that being said, I want to open it up to the speakers now to take a stab at the first question. And then if anyone in the audience has a question, come up to the front and feel free to ask away.
And you can also provide high quality free advice in addition to questions.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, since you've been on both sides of it, how do you see the difference in funding big projects and research government-wise and in private groups? What is the government really good at in terms of funding, and what is it terrible at, such that there's a real opportunity for philanthropic or corporate support?
Yeah. So the government isn't a terribly useful level of abstraction. There's a pretty significant difference between, for example, the Department of Labor and DARPA. So I would say that we have agencies that are capable of funding research when it relates to biomedical research, national security, energy, space, and basic science. If you look at all the agencies that are responsible for worrying about the bottom half of the income distribution, those agencies have little or no capacity to support research and development that is motivated by their mission. So I think the big problem that we have in terms of science funding, we have many problems, but that those agencies that have the responsibility for worrying about poverty alleviation and economic and social mobility have either zero capability, that the research and development budget of the Department of Labor is literally zero, or have very limited capacity. So that's an area where I think philanthropy could be playing a role.
Was it me? Okay. Hi, thanks, Tom. So I love moonshot thinking. echoing, or is me just me hearing it?
No, I think
Okay, all right. One of the things that worries me, and you maybe just referred to it there, is that we have moonshots and we know what to do with them in the science domain and technology. And we are so far ahead on that front that we fall behind on our social, organizational, regulatory structures. And that gap is getting wider and wider every year. So can we have moonshots to eliminate inequality, homelessness?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So the Department of Defense started a program where the goal was to reduce the time for a Navy recruit. So these are people who typically have a high school degree or GED equivalent to gain a technical skill in months rather than years. So that's an example of something where if the department, so a big challenge that we have is that many non-college educated workers are seeing stagnant or declining real wages. And there is certainly at least the potential that further technological change could reduce the demand for workers with relatively low skills. So an example of a societal moonshot would be take someone who is currently in a minimum wage job and give them a skill that is a ticket to a middle-class job, a family supporting wage, and be able to do that in months rather than years. So I do think that we can pursue these, but the reason that we haven't in some cases is that the relevant patron, the relevant part of the federal government that has responsibility for that issue has never been given the capability to invest in research and innovation.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Julian. Okay, we have time for one more question from the anonymous card deck, and this just asks about generally your opinion on black swans. Do we live in Mediocrestan or Extremistan?
Well, we do empirically we do see black swans. We see things that certainly people, if you look at financial markets, for example, that we're using value at risk methodology, they got that wrong. So we absolutely see these. And I think that if you think about weather and climate, if you start to see 100-year or 1,000-year events occurring every other year, that's also an indication that we are living, as one person put it, in post-normal times.
Yeah, we were joking that it seems like we added up a new season. It's the season where everyone in San Francisco starts wearing gas masks around this time. All right. Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.